Hello to everyone who's watching us remotely. And this topic today is going to be about fake news. Caroline Greer from Cloudflare was very kind to sponsor this little event. We've got at 8 o'clock some drinks afterwards and a little bit of food. But in the meantime, I hope that we're going to get a very interesting debate. And I think we'll start with the panelists and so on. I'll leave it all over to Maria Farrell to moderate this. And I also hope that you'll be able to take part in this debate afterwards. We've got plenty of time in front of us. And I think I've already said a bit too much, so I can just turn it over to Maria. So thank you.
Great. Okay, so my name is Maria Farrell. I write about internet-y things and have been working on internet governance for quite a few years. So I'm going to introduce our panel. So on my left, we have Karim Palant, who is the public policy manager for Facebook in the UK. Right beside him, Dominic Connor, who is a journalist and a headhunter and an all-around man who knows lots about the city, lots about all sorts of things that we're going to be hearing about. Here on my right, we have Gabrielle Gilman, who works for the Article 19. Article 19? Yeah, you just called Article 19, which is... It's an international free speech organization called after, okay, I always get this wrong, Article 19, which is the freedom of expression article in, is it the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, or is it the UN Declaration on Human Rights?
Well, conveniently, it's both.
It's both. Doubling up. Excellent. That's it. Brilliant. And someone who needs absolutely no introduction to this group or many groups in this city, Philip Virgo, who is Mr. Parliament for Internet people, I think, for a lot of us for many, many years, and who is on the advisory board of the Digital Policy Alliance. And online, we have Joanna Kuleta, who is a professor of law at the University of Lodz in Poland. So Joanna is actually going to kick it off with sort of a chapeau introduction to the topic and her thoughts on some of the landmines, which I hope we will be stepping on with gleeful abandon during this discussion. Joanna, over to you. All right, well, while Olivier is figuring out, perhaps, or Joanna is figuring out what's going on, I'm going to give you a couple of definitions of fake news, because I think fake news is one of those things like, you know, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. Well, fake news is one of those things that is a little bit in the eye of the beholder. So here are a couple of definitions. One is really long. Fake news, from Wikipedia, this one is, a type of yellow journalism that consists of deliberate misinformation or hoaxes via traditional and online media and online social media. It is written and published with the intent to mislead in order to gain financially or politically. Now, I think intent is something we're going to be coming back to, because a lot of this stuff that flies around is often written by people who actually believe that the Sandy Hook primary school shooting didn't happen, or people who believe that MMR vaccination causes autism. So anyway, intent to mislead is part of one definition of fake news. Another definition, and this one is crowdsourced by the Macmillan Dictionary, fake news is a sensational piece of news which does not map to reality. I think that's a wonderful euphemism, mapping to reality. Created to attract attention or damage somebody's reputation. So there we're talking about slander, libel, and those sorts of things. And then the third one, the last one, is from the Urban Dictionary, the Urban Dictionary is a fantastic resource for middle-aged people who want to keep up with teenage slang. And here is what they say. Fake news is, or a way to avoid using critical thinking when a news source does not match your personal or ideological bias. So my trusted news source is your fake news. So I think that's something we're going to be coming back to a bit. Olivier, is the problem with the sound terminal? Ah, she's going to beam back into us, is she? Excellent.
So thank you for having me once again. And thank you for the definitions, Maria. I think the definitions are crucial to discussing the problem. Thank you for the brief recap. I particularly enjoy the Urban Dictionary. I'm happy you mentioned that. I have a few slides, a few headlines that I wanted to share with you. We'll just see if that one works. I wanted to share my screen with you just to show you a few headlines that I think are relevant for the discussion that we are having. I'll start off with the question of definition with regard to one of the panelists, one of the organizations that's present in the room, that's represented by Gabrielle tonight. Article 19, together with a bunch of other activists and organizations, have done a great job in trying to create a joint declaration on fake news. I think it's a very worthy endeavor. I'm glad you guys did it, but I'm looking forward to comments from Gabrielle. I think that you also face the challenge of defining fake news. On one hand, you rightfully observe that the right to freedom of speech covers also controversial expression, covers also issues that are not neutral, that are not consented to by everyone. But you also emphasize, as mentioned by Maria in the various definitions, that it should be prevented to distribute information that is knowingly or recklessly false. Now, I personally have a problem when it comes to the legal interpretation of that definition with the target that is behind it. So you mentioned that it's officials and state actors who should refrain from disseminating such information. Now, this implies that on one hand, we have the right to be controversial, but on the other hand, we would expect officials or state actors, I understand this would be politicians, either in power or in opposition, to refrain from recklessly false statements. I'll just give you an example that I hope will make this case clear. Now, I would not expect politicians to stop lying. Now, that to me is utterly optimistic. So we have to assume that certain groups will not always tell us the truth. And I dare to say that in front of a UK audience, and I think you guys have witnessed this at its best. So on one hand, I agree that we should not instinctively, we should not deliberately be lying as humans. But on the other hand, when you look at it from the legal point of view, there is no prohibition of lie as such. Now, on one hand, we could say journalists have an obligation of due diligence. We expect journalists to seek to pursue the truth. If they fail, we can try to find legal measures to stop them. But we could not expect everyone, especially politicians, acting or being in the opposition, to actually refrain from altering reality, from altering facts, or not relying on facts as we want them to. So I have a problem with the definition. I have the problem with expecting that everyone in the world will stop lying, will stop altering the facts. And with that, it will be very difficult to legally pursue what is defined as fake news. Now, journalism has always been either supporting the opposition or the leading party. This goes back as long as diplomacy, as long as political struggles. So fake news as a prohibition addressed at politicians, to my eyes, seems a missed legal concept. But having said that, and being fully aware of the problems we are having with definitions, it seems that Germany is pursuing exactly this path. Now, when we spoke with Olivier about this roughly, a month or 2 months ago, this was just a draft. But now Germany went ahead, and they do actually have a law that is supposed to stop fake news. It doesn't define fake news. It just takes what we've had in the e-commerce directive, the ISP liability concept, a step further. So instead of requesting the ISPs to act based on reliable information that is likely to be in violation of law, Germany is fined if the ISPs do not act quickly enough. Just that's the very general idea behind the law. So there's no definition of fake news. There's just a punishment for the ISPs who fail to comply with their obligations quickly enough. Now, when I look at what's happening in Germany, when I look what's happening across Europe, trying to fight fake news with laws, I keep asking myself, whatever happened to the undesired chilling effect of ISP liability we've been going on about since the very dawn of the e-commerce directive? We've always had a problem with the fact that the e-commerce directive expects ISPs to act as one instance court. So when there is content that is likely to be illegal, we put up a notice, we expect the ISP to act and disable access. Now, for those of us who are dealing with human rights, this has always been a problem, because it's the ISP that is the one court that decides on limiting your freedom of expression. It always seemed a problem. Just to give you an example of how this was perceived, not just in Europe, but also beyond, this is what used to be the Chilling Effect Clearinghouse. It's now called Lumen. So this is what the Berkman Center is doing, trying to identify the copyright claims that are effectively chilling the freedom of expression online advocates at some point. So copyright is being used to stop freedom of expression at times legitimately. So ISPs would be likely to disable access to content that they fear might be illegal, even though they do not have the appropriate information, the appropriate legal analysis. This is what's happening in Europe now as well. As you could see, Facebook claims, and I'm happy to know that Facebook representative is also in the House tonight, that Facebook is worried that this undesired chilling effect is coming about also with fake news. Now, it seems as we are going even a step further than just endorsing the ISP liability and the chilling effect we've had thus far, because now we're using algorithms. So it's not just the ISP that's going to make that decision is going to be made automatically. I'm sure the algorithms debate is coming. I'm sure there will be participants in the room discussing algorithms and the role in fighting fake news, but this seems to be a fact. It's Facebook, right before the UK general election, that announced that they are going to trace how the information became popular in the Facebook feed and block it before it becomes even more popular. So it's not even the decision of an ISP, it's not even a human decision to decide whether news is fake or real. It is going to be an algorithm that does that. Summing up the introduction to the discussion, I'm pretty sure that fake news is not a safe legal category. Even though policy must react to public expectations, people expect to be given reliable information. I'm looking forward to discussing the OII or Professor Datton's report on fake news. I would be happy to participate in that part of the debate as well. But I understand we must react to what the public is expecting. I understand we must protect people from fake news. I'm just not sure that a fake news law, as Germany now has it, is the right way to do it. We have laws in place that are supposed to ensure journalistic liability for lack of due diligence. We have other areas of law that prohibit lies. I'm not sure that politicians are encompassed in those regulations. I would be very reluctant to leave those decisions that the international courts, European Court of Human Rights, has had a challenge interpreting to code, to algorithms. So algorithms used for identifying and blocking fake news, to my eyes, seems a very unsound idea from the legal perspective. Algorithms need more transparency. When I speak to the technical community, they say, well, it's not that difficult. It's nothing too challenging. It's 2 + 2, that's 4. That's your algorithm. It's not a black box. Now, to me as a lawyer, it seems a black box. And I've talked to some policy people who say, well, it's not that simple. Algorithms can be tweaked to cause a certain reaction, to bring about a certain result. I think we need to discuss algorithms, transparency, and make sure that the users understand how they work. So I'm going to argue at the beginning of this debate for more transparency for algorithms. I was asked to speak for roughly 10 minutes. I think I made it, Maria. I apologize if I'm over time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joanna. That was both very prompt, to the point, and yet quite comprehensive. Thank you. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to invite each of the speakers on our panel to give us a little 3-minute précis of their initial take on the topic. And from there, we're going to go into a more cut and thrust questions. Now, I'm going to warn you all, when I'm chairing things, I do sometimes tend to interrupt people and ask them questions, or ask them questions that I think somebody else might ask them. So do be prepared, but I will not interrupt you during your first statements. So first off, let's go left to right. Karim, would you mind kicking off?
Sure. Do I need a... because I've got a slide. Do you want to take this off, please? It's all right. It's all right. It might be quite helpful because I actually scribbled some notes and they're on different pages, so I actually might use this. Yeah, so I know we're going to get into, I mean, we've already had a couple of things up there of kind of things that Facebook has done or has not done in this area. So I know we're going to get into the nitty gritty, but I wanted to start with a bit of an overview of kind of the big picture as I suppose I see it. The big picture is that the way people consume, the starting point is the way people consume news and information has gone through several pretty radical shifts over the last 15, 20 years. I mean, first of all, you know, it shifted online. There was a shift to social sharing. There was a shift to, and a really big shift over the last few years, a very small number of years, actually, surprisingly, around the consumption of content, certainly on our platform on mobile, which is actually a kind of fairly gone unnoticed, but actually a big shift in the way people consume news compared to 5-10 years ago, and almost as big as the shift online in the first place. And then you now have a shift into sort of video and VR as well as a big part of, you know, over the next sort of, we think over the next 5 years as well, and that's going to have a big impact as well, the sharing of video on mobile and so on. So that's the big picture. And if you you know, it's changed the way we consume not just news, but a whole range of information, a whole range of cultural products, whether it be film, video, TV, music. And it's not necessarily been for the worst. You know, there was a lot of doom mongers 15, 20 years ago would say the music industry is dead and so on. And actually, if you look at the way that particular content has gone, that's not really what's happened. And TV, video, and film also have changed radically. But actually, the content, good quality content, is still being produced. So if you think about what happened to news on the shift to mobile, it's what's really, you know, we feel a real, you know, it's been particularly hit over the last few years, and you know, as a platform of 2 billion people, we feel a responsibility to the fact, and you know, I've heard government ministers talk about this, and I've heard journalists talk about this, that, you know, inherent to democracy is a free press, a strong, sustainable free press with journalists at its heart. And I think I think that everyone's on the same page on that front, and that's a really important feature of a democracy. And we would want to make sure that whatever happens as this shift goes on, that continues. So there's a question about whether, if that's the case, why is fake news such an issue, and why is fake such suddenly become, over the last sort of year, such a talking point? And fake news has always existed. You know, people have told stories, people have used propaganda. This has always been a thing. So why has fake suddenly become a big thing over the last year or so? Is it the nature of the format and the way people are sharing news on mobile? Is it that there's a vacuum, that there's been a big shift in the way people consume news, and mainstream publishers and mainstream policymakers haven't adapted to that? Or is it the nature of some of the platforms? And that's a question that we feel very personally, very directly, is it the nature of the way these platforms work that's doing that? And so that sets a very significant challenge, which is where I want to end, which is a challenge for us, which we, you know, accept and reflect on, which is, one, philosophical. We certainly don't feel we should be the arbiters of truth and what's right and wrong in terms of the responsibilities that are put on us as a platform in terms of what people share on our platform. So there's a philosophical question: can there be an arbiter of truth? Should people be deciding what is and isn't shared? Second of all, there's a technological question, which is, what if you do accept that there's a sort of a barrier and a limit to what should and shouldn't be shared, that goes beyond whether it's people deliberately using click farms and a spammy experience, which is less about fake or not. It's much more clearly, where the intent is very clearly money making around the edges, and attracting clicks and so on. Is there something that you can do at that point technologically? And those are technological barriers that we face. I'll have to talk in a bit more detail about those. And then the final one is, why is fakes feel so visceral for people at the moment? And I think part of that is about the fact that societies do feel at the moment very as if there isn't a sort of set of shared facts that we can share, a shared understanding that we can all share, sort of from which we can all debate the issues of the day. I feel much more polarized and much more divided. And I think Mark Zuckerberg, our CEO, in February published a letter where he reflected on this fact and whether social media played a role in accentuating that or reducing that or not. And I think that's a very important question for us to ask ourselves. It's also a very big question for audiences like this to discuss. And do we have a responsibility as a platform to do more to, as we term it with our new mission statement, which is to bring the world closer together, or should we simply be connecting people and not taking a view that we have a responsibility to make sure that we're helping people to build a collective understanding of fact? And that's some of the tools we might build, some of the ways in which we promote, some of the ways in which we encourage people to share and give people the power to share. How does that, how do we design our platform with a view to certain things happening and people being able to interact in a different way? So I think I suppose that would be my overview, my kind of big picture view, but I'm sure we'll get into the nitty gritty.
Thank you very much, Karim. Dominic, Karim, you.
Well, I'm glad that Facebook doesn't see itself as the arbiter of truth, because, well, that's my job. I'm mostly going to be speaking as a journalist this evening. And first of all, of course, everything I've ever written is fake news. Even the really quite mainstream articles on how to use Visual Basic to drive databases is fake news. I have aggregated together various things that I believe and occasionally hope to be true and tried to make them interesting. I've tried to come up with clickbait headlines. As it turns out, as more than one of my editors explained to me, I have no talent for clickbait headlines, which is a bit sad. But one of the reasons that I still get commissioned is that for whatever reason, I get a decent number of clicks. And one of my editors took me out for a drink a couple of years ago and explained to me that in a some sort of technological breakthrough, which is how he seemed to see it, they'd connected up the content management system, which counted clicks, to the ad sales system, which could therefore tell them exactly, literally to the penny, how much money I made them. He was at pains to say that that shouldn't affect what I write, but it can't not affect the way I write. Most of what you read is written by freelancers. I'm a freelancer. I know Philip written on a freelance basis. Most journalists are, to a greater or later extent, freelance. And those of them that actually have so-called permanent jobs, you only have to read Private Eye to notice that it's actually not that permanent. So you've got that as one of your problems. Next, there's this demented notion, which I see in some of the media, that we check our facts and we have sources and things. Again, one of my editors rang me up Monday, and he was checking whether the thing I'd worked on was a thing called the Contents Addressable File Store, or as I'd called it, the Contents Addressable File System. Now, I'd worked on this thing, and it turned out when he looked in Wikipedia, for the last however many years, I've been giving it the wrong name. I look these things up, and we then look at what are the sources we use if we want clicks. And we look at Mark Ruffalo. Professor Mark Ruffalo, Regis Professor of Geophysics at Queen Mary College, London. Oh no, he's the third best person who's ever played the Incredible Hulk. But you go into The Guardian, you will find him cited not once, but dozens of times as an authority on fracking. He has, according to his Wikipedia entry, which because it's Wikipedia, it must be true, he has a progressive education and has worked as an actor. And we have Lily Allen explaining to us the conspiracy theory behind that terrible tower block fire. You think, Lily Allen? Whistleblower? No, she's a celebrity as well. Now, I saw the interview with her and Jon Snow. I saw that she was going to be on Newsnight. The Guardian isn't stupid. I actually know Jon Snow. He's definitely not stupid. But if he wants to keep his job, if he wants to get you people to click on him, he's going to have to cite sources such as mediocre actresses and the third best portrayer of the Incredible Hulk. Now, fracking is not like there isn't anyone who knows about fracking. I don't know about fracking, but some people do. And are you going to look up well-researched sources? Or are you going to look up Donald Trump's sex change operation? I don't know that it is a sex change operation. Perhaps I've just started my own fake news here. Also, one of the things I found quite quaint in some article about fake news was how good the fake news people have got at writing things that look like real news. Well, if you were to find out how much journalists get paid, you would find out how easy it is to hire journalists to write things that are just like the thing they've done for what we might call mainstream media. I'm coming up against my intro limit here, but Mark Zuckerberg, culturally, even though he's an American and we've never met, I get the impression that Mark Zuckerberg is a geek like me, although a rather richer geek than me. Film about me yet. But whatever power you are handing Facebook, and let's be clear, we are handing power to Facebook. If you want them to police fake news, I understand, possibly as fake news, that they've hired 5,000 people to get rid of bad stuff. Perhaps we'll hear what the bad stuff is. If you're going to hand that power to Facebook, you are handing it not just to Mark, I'm calling him Mark now, one first name terms, but you are handing it to whoever takes over from Mark and to Donald Trump, because Mark Zuckerberg is an American citizen. So you are handing this power over to Donald Trump, and if Donald Trump happens to become impeached, a man handpicked by Donald Trump to be the next president of the United States. And in Germany, you are handing that power to Angela Merkel. Angela Merkel, the same Angela Merkel, who was quite happy for a comedian to be prosecuted under German criminal law for upsetting a foreign head of state. There are many British comedians who regard that as their job. But you are handing that power to her and whoever takes over from her. So whatever power you think people should have to protect us from fake news, and let's be clear, we're not saying protect us from fake news. No one in this room thinks they need protecting from fake news. There are the others, the less clever than us, the less sophisticated, and the people that vote the wrong way. That is the people you want protecting because they disagree with you. They disagreed with you on Brexit. They disagreed with you on Donald Trump. They disagreed with you on Marie Le Pen. They probably disagree with you on fracking as well. And you want them to think like you do. Well, guess what? They don't. And the more you pretend that yours is the only source of truth, the more they will believe mad stuff. Thank you.
So just before Gabrielle comes in there, I have to say I'm really hung up on something that Dominic said, and I'm going to have to firmly disagree with it. Mark Ruffalo as the third best actor to play the Incredible Hulk. See, to my mind, that means the first best, the best, is David Banner's original on the television series, Bill Bixby. That means that the second best must be Edward Norton. Yes. I'm going to have to disagree with you on that. Okay. Well, actually, I think he was the best.
I was torn between Edward Norton. Sorry, I was torn between Edward Norton, the CGI Incredible Hulk, and the man whose name I've forgotten who played the actual Incredible Hulk in the Bill Bixby series, which wasn't Bill Bixby in a rubber suit. Lou Ferrand, that's it, who played it with considerably greater depth and possibly knows more about fracking.
Thank you. And with that brief interlude, I'll pass you on to Gabrielle.
Well, thanks very much for the invitation. So, as Maria was saying earlier, Article 19, for those who are not familiar with our work, we're an international human rights organization based in London. So a lot of the work that we do is analyze legislation, often restricting freedom of expression, and analyzing it against international standards on free expression, like the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and other regional instruments. And so for us, and as Joanna pointed out earlier, fake news is not a new phenomenon. So I guess that would be my first point. In fact, for many years, we've analyzed countless provisions on what was not called fake news, actually, but rather false information. And so in several countries around the world, there are provisions in the press code, in the criminal law, that criminalize the dissemination of false information. So to give you an example, in the Gambia, hopefully things will change now that Yahya Jammeh has gone. But for a long time, the dissemination of false information or broadcasting false information was punishable with a minimum of 1 year imprisonment. I was recently analyzing the press code of Senegal, which was just adopted. So one of the ways in which you can have the criminalization of false information is also when you transpose some of the ethics of journalism into a code. So, for example, when it comes to the duties and responsibilities of journalists to check the accuracy of the information, take reasonable steps or not, in relation to facts. Now, when you find that in a code, and then later on you go to the sections on criminal actions, then it's another way in which sometimes the work of journalists can be seriously impeded because they criminalize, they comply with the ethics of journalism. There are lots of other areas where you can find references to false information. Like another areas, for example, is defamation, because defamation is all about false statements of facts, or at least that's what individuals might be alleging. So there are many different ways in which false news come up. Another way, another area in particular where we find them is in relation to terrorism. In many countries, it's actually quite tricky to report on, to cover terrorist attacks. So, for instance, in Egypt, the fact that like, covering terrorist events can be penalized if it doesn't really conform to the official version of what happened. So as I said, not a new phenomenon. Now, what is the problem with fake news from our perspective? And here I completely agree with what Joanna was saying, and I'll talk other points later on. But essentially, the problem is that, fake news is a concept that's inherently vague. What is fake news? It is incredibly difficult to distinguish between statements of facts and opinions. So when, in particular, governments start criminalizing or imposing liability, whether on technology companies or individuals, for disseminating false information, then we're in trouble, because this can have a serious chilling effect on the sharing of opinions and ideas on all sorts of topics. So now, I think, like, one of the things that was already mentioned is, like, this concept of, like, what's fake, what is the truth? And I think, like, here, there's a very good quote from Joel Bernard Shaw, which is, new opinions often appear first as jokes and fancies, then as blasphemies and treason, then as questions open to discussion, and finally as established truth. So I think it tells you something about people's relationship with truth. So I think I'll end here in relation to some of the issues we see from an international perspective. I think there's many other things we can discuss in relation to what does that mean in the online world. Actually, we haven't been able to find in the German law that's been cited so extensively an actual reference to fake news, because for us, what we've seen is that it was trying to apply various duties in relation to lots of information that's already criminalized under German law, but not necessarily defining as such fake news. But obviously, we're hoping that whatever the Germans have been pushing forward is not an indication of the direction of travel in terms of legislation, because that would be very, very worrying. So.
Thank you, Gabrielle. Philip, can you please share your comments?
Well, I'll begin with a question to the audience. How many of you at school had to read Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars? Now, that begins with a set of fake news which basically destroys two ways of life. First of all, there are the allegations about the behavior of the Gauls that he uses to justify an invasion, killing millions of people, to steal their gold, so that he can then use the gold to fund an election campaign to destroy the Roman Republic. Now, I do commend Tom Standage's book, The Writing on the Wall, as a history of social media, because it takes the social media back to the first literate societies where people were circulating letters. Then, you fast forward, you have the walls of the pamphlets in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, the Communist Manifesto, but then, and these are all relatively social media, small-scale operations. Then comes the printing press. And at that point, followed by the radio, and at that point, news becomes what the proprietors of the printing presses and the radio stations say it is, whether it's Lord Rothermere, Lord Reith, Joseph Goebbels, or Joseph Stalin. Then, supposedly, the wonderful internet and social media gives us back power again to us. And yet, when you look at it, the internet is one of the most concentrated media the world has ever seen. Look at the position of Google, Microsoft, Facebook, etc. And then, of course, you've got the wonderful combination that Jeff Bezos, rather annoyed with fake news about the value of online advertising, decides to buy the Washington Post so as to expose the behavior of his competitors. Very well researched, very good stuff. I do recommend reading it. But what you have there, which of that news is genuine, which of it is fake? I would say that one of the issue we've got at the moment is the feeling of those who go online, who think they're terribly clever, that they feel betrayed, that they can't actually believe what they see online. But then most of the world has never believed what it read in the newspapers anyway, or what it heard on wireless. We actually believe what we want to believe. So that's, but then I was asked to look at the threat to democracy. And one of the lovely definitions of democracy I like, bear in mind, the internet is now global. We Westerners, with our liberal attitudes, are a minority of the users of the internet. An alternative view of democracy, which I picked up from a paper in Finland, which of an ASEAN conference, where none of the speakers had English as their native language, but they'd used English as the lingua franca. And the West doesn't understand democracy. What they call democracy is a situation where the person who shouts loudest and has the best lawyers dictates what happens. Real democracy is where we listen to the enthusiasm of youth, but then the older and wiser people take decisions in due course without worrying about votes or things of that kind. Now, in the online democracy, who's got the loudest voice? And the answer is, it's the student who controls the biggest botnet over the university network from his bedroom. When we're looking at these things, we do need to look at the effect of technology and remember that we're dealing with very old phenomena. And I would argue a very good look at the warnings is what Joseph Goebbels did before Hitler came to power. His use of social media under the Weimar Republic. And in particular, the very simple one, a lie told once is a lie. A lie told 1,000 times becomes the truth. And it's the use of technology to multiply views which don't really deserve to be multiplied, but they will be. They will be multiplied by people we don't like in all sorts of ways. But to my mind, the biggest threat in the last election wasn't actually the false news. It was the way in which female politicians and also male politicians with families were hounded off the social media and off the internet with a whole vitriol of abuse, which actually leaves us with being ruled by politicians who are capable of fighting fire with fire and muck with muck. And interesting question, is that what we really want? And if we don't, how do we actually address the issues? And here we come to a very dodgy argument, because the only way of actually clearing out fake news is attribution of sources, i.e. removing anonymity. But on the other hand, if you remove anonymity, I've spent quite a lot of time handling whistleblowing situations. How do you actually allow for investigation against abuse of power? But remember that the French, in France, anonymous whistleblowing is illegal, because that was how, during the days of Vichy, people got hold of their neighbor's wife, their neighbor's land, their neighbor's business. They denounced them to the milice. Anonymous whistleblowing is itself a dangerous act. So, when you come down to it, what do you do? And I would argue that possibly one of the ways forward is to be able to refuse to accept communications from people who do not identify themselves. Those who wish to be anonymous, fine. But if you don't want to receive communications from people who remain anonymous, you don't have to. And I should say, Guido Fawkes has got a splendid argument on this afternoon, on the arguments. Basically, he's making a massive attack on the idea of stripping away anonymization. And if you actually look at the posters on Guido Fawkes, I'm one of only about 6 people who uses a genuine name. Interesting question. Why are they so ashamed of their views they're not willing to be attributed?
Thank you, Philip. I got so carried away listening to you, I forgot that I was going to have to actually say something afterwards. Yes, the online harassment and abuse. Tricky one, that. I'm trying to. Does anyone remember what year was the Hurricane Katrina? 2007? Yeah. That will be when I got my first rape threat and my first murder threat for things I wrote on the internet under my real name, because I blog. Only on Sunday I got emails from a very particular and actually and sometimes quite charming Australian stalker who's convinced that I've committed all sorts of terrible crimes against him and I'm going to be prosecuted, which all goes to say this is tricky stuff. So Kareem, I'm going to put you on the spot because Dominic I'm going to mischaracterize. This is another thing I do when I'm chairing. I horribly mischaracterize things people say. Dominic has sort of talked about fake news as journalism that irritates us. So the Lily Allens, the annoying things in The Guardian, that sort of thing. But I mean, when I think about fake news, irritation has always been around. But I'm thinking about things like in the US election headlines such as WikiLeaks confirms Hillary sold weapons to ISIS. FBI agent suspected in Hillary email leaks found dead. And this was my favorite one as an Irish Catholic. Pope Francis shocks the world and endorses Donald Trump. Now, this stuff is kind of amusing, but of course we know, as Philip mentioned, it's the multiplier effect, isn't it? So could you just perhaps give us a little more information about, how is so what I'm talking about is, I'm not talking about the irritating end of the spectrum. We're talking about the democracy changing, potentially state actor-driven type of misinformation. So can you tell us about the challenges that poses to you as one of the big platforms?
Sure, thank you. I mean, I think, so actually I'm going to add a fourth category. So there's, I sort of split it into, there's, I suppose there's probably 4 different buckets that I'd put some of this stuff into. So one of the headlines that I think was shown on the screen before about removing fake news accounts, actually was slightly fake newsy in itself. What actually we did in that circumstance, and it was in the run-up to the UK election, the Facebook's policy is that you are your authentic self on Facebook. We ask people to use their real names or what they're known by in their day-to-day lives. That's because that's what this platform is. It's not the only way to run a platform. There are other platforms that don't require that. Indeed, Instagram, which is Facebook-owned, doesn't require that. So there are lots of different ways you could run a platform. We find that people we find that there are ways in which you can, using technology, you can create a lot of accounts that don't go by that policy, and they tend to engage in some pretty unpleasant behavior, whether it be sharing knowingly fake stuff with a view to getting clicks for a sort of a click farm type spammy experience, or whether it be spreading hate or deliberate misinformation on behalf of foreign actors, like a foreign government and so on. Whatever the mix is, we find that those accounts tend to be, undermining the experience for users. So we created some technology that helped identify those accounts, review them, and remove them, and we removed tens of thousands of those. That's not arbitrating truth. It's just it's enforcing the policies on our platform, which is a different question. So there's a spammy. There's also certain types of news that is deliberately done in the same way as spam is done, which is to try and think of, without regard to truth, without regard to anything else, just to think about what's the way in which I can get to the most possible clicks to share. It can be all kinds of motivations, and there's that's a much harder thing to police than the fake accounts question. But I think users on our platform would expect us to have some kind of view about how we can ensure that happens to a lesser degree. And then there is the sort of deliberate propaganda that's about spreading misinformation about people and so on. And that's a much more difficult thing to police. It's a whole level beyond. And then the final.
I could have crossed you there and ask you a bit about that one. So, so the deliberate propaganda, the potentially state actor stuff. I know there are ongoing investigations in the US about whether, particular accounts were used on Facebook, many hundreds of thousands of accounts to propagate this sort of disinformation. And so it's not just something that happens on the platform, it's quite a specific problem that is.
We published a very detailed paper which is online, which analyzes the attempts by several actors, including foreign governments, to influence elections, to influence debate on particular topics. To some degree, this has always happened. This isn't new, but our platform provides a new way of doing it, and so we've analysed, so from a sort of cybersecurity perspective as well as from a kind of policy perspective and how we might tackle it, those issues, and published a kind of white paper explaining the evidence we have and so on. So I think I'd urge everyone to have a read of that. A final category is the hate category, and speech that may not be true or untrue, but goes into hateful. And that's a very difficult thing to obviously define. If you take all of those categories, what they have in common is that there is is it the responsibility of an individual platform or an individual person to say that's okay, that's not okay? Very, very hard things to define. It's a thing that societies tend to develop amongst themselves. And the way we look at it is that the big question is not, have we got that particular judgment right, or have we got that particular judgment right, and what's the technological solution to this? The big question is, do online platforms tend towards helping to create consensus, debate, discussion amongst people, shared understanding of truth, shared understanding of outcomes. There's always going to be debate. There's always going to be disagreement. There's always going to be, but does there something about the technology that's driving people apart, that's causing people, so for example, I'll finish on an example. We find that when somebody shares a link to a news story without having read the story, and obviously you can test that, without having read the story, we find that there tends to be more likely to be in some way abusive or in some way deliberately misleading in a really obvious way. So, obviously that's hard to define, but we find that that tends to be a thing. So if someone is sharing a news story without having read it, the experience of the people they share it to is less good than if they've shared it having read it, because maybe the headline was particularly well crafted and was drawing people in or so on. We've made a judgment call, and we talked about it publicly, that therefore we should probably reflect the fact that someone has read the story in how powerfully that's then shared on to other people in terms of in talking about transparency around algorithms and so on. So talking about some of those discussions publicly, we hope will kind of bring people into those choices and discussions.
So you're saying, so if I just, see an article and go, I really believe it, I believe in that headline because that's outrageous and I want to share it with my friends, that's probably not going to the top of their feeds.
Look, it's all an algorithm, so there's different factors at play, but we will relative to if you'd stopped, read it and absorbed it, it will be further down.
Thank you. Dominic, so how serious is a problem is this? Is it a big problem? We've been around this block a few times.
Well, I think there's several problems that kind of converge on each other. One, of course, is that I don't have a magic truth tree. I'm a journalist. I get to hear things that the general public doesn't hear. I get people, there's a whole swarm of people whose job it is to tell me things. Many of those things are actually true. But when I'm forming my view of the world, if I were to be influenced by fake news, that would go into my own input, which would go into what people refer to as legitimate media. So I'm definitely affected by that. Also, there is the fact-checking thing. If you can just bung your story onto the internet and it gets transmitted, you will actually beat me to the punch. And that affects how quickly I can check facts. Just the simple test of Facebook, something has happened at Facebook. I have to ring up, for instance, if I want to check a story about Google, I have to ring up their PR people, wait an hour for them not to respond, and then I can publish it. But someone, because Google's PR are Google's PR, it is not a compulsory thing to get a quote from Google PR. They don't like journalists, as far as I can tell. So one of the things that really does is hurt me when I want to get a story. I hear something quickly. I don't work heavily in the instant happening news, but when I do hear a story, I'm in the pits of typing it, and they will pop up on a screen on Twitter or something. And that really is hurting journalists, that need to speed things up. I know some of the outlets, what they do is they sling pretty much a sort of stream of consciousness on the screen and edit it step by step. They get a fact, they get another fact, and eventually they end up with something that's, as truthful as one gets. But of course, each edit will propagate around the internet with varying degrees of truth. But they do that to get the story out there more quickly. And one thing, there is a fix for fake news. And it's not journalism, and it's not even our good friends at Facebook. It's you lot. You do not share well-researched stories. You do not share stories that go into depth. You share stories that agree with your view of the world, and you send it to other people who agree with your view of the world. Who in the last week has shared an article that was well written, but they disagreed with? 2. Right.
Thank you for your honesty, folks.
But that's where we are. 3. But that's where we are. And that's why you get the sort of articles you want. As a journalist, I've written some quite harsh things about some computer companies. And some of them have wanted to explain their view of the world to me. I've never ever heard of an advertiser saying to a publisher, your stuff is just garbage. They don't say, they will complain if it's against them, but they won't say, see that article you did on, new Intel processors. Intel will complain about it, but someone else won't complain. They say, yeah, got a lot of clicks. We got a lot of clicks on our ad. We don't care. And when you have advertisers that do not care, and looking around this room, I see some people who work for companies that do a lot of advertising, which does include our good friends Facebook, who do a lot of advertising. I never, ever hear of big advertisers ever saying, why don't you just put out better content? They want more clicks. They want the right sort of people. So you can't have a better journalistic profession than you have readership. So you lot need to step up.
Too true. A friend of mine who works at the Guardian, yes, I do have friends who work at the Guardian, sorry, said to me last year that a story on Syria in August, on the very top of the front page, got 200 clicks on day one, which is kind of horrifying. None of us are clicking on stories about Syria. Is this, Dominic, I'm going to come back to you, part of the fake news problem, a journalism problem, and a media industry problem?
No. We're trying to do a good job. Actually, I know various journalists. Some of my
no, sorry, I should have been clearer. Is it a problem to do with the general health of the media ecosystem and people having less?
Oh yes. Well, I did bring in. My son at the front, who is my consultant about younger people, and who's now sitting with his head in his hands, being embarrassed. What he refers to as...
Is it on? You're trying to...
So I'll start again. My son, who's sitting with his head in his hands because he's embarrassed about me, he's my sort of ambassador to younger people. So he came with this marvelous phrase, which was backward compatible media. This is the media who try to be in the modern world, on the web and Twitter, etc., but who still do things with dead trees. And I brought in one of the big dead tree vendors, The Times, who has been going on about Google and Facebook and how evil they are. Phrases like blood on their hands and all those other things. And you think, well, we've had that tower block fire. There's Brexit going on. Donald Trump is being Donald Trump. No doubts, over the last 3 months, we had an election, terrorist attacks. You just go and count the number of front pages of major newspapers which are attacks on social media firms. And I'll just do the numbers here. Now, these are round numbers, so I'm in danger of spreading fake news. So when I was at PC Mag, one of our senior guys was put into special projects. For those of you that have not worked in the media, special projects is what happens to senior people that everyone likes, but for various reasons they don't want them to do that job anymore. And he was put in charge of putting PC Mag online, because we rather thought as a computer magazine we ought to be online. And I wandered out. He actually got an office out of it. And I wandered over to him, and he was basically complaining that people were ringing him up, demanding that they put adverts in amongst all the good articles we were putting up in the web. And he'd actually had to find a salesman to actually deal with these people, because at this particular publisher, there was a strict, what we called separation of church and state. We never spoke to advertisers about advertising as journalists. In those days, and we're now talking about the early 90s, basically, there were two ways a publisher was funded from advertising. Either they sold an ad, in which case they got 100% of the revenue, or some agency was involved, and we're talking 80 to 85% of the money went to the firm that made the article. We scroll forward very, very rapidly to 2017, and it's about 1 minus that. In other words, 80-ish, 85% of what an advertiser pays does not go to the publisher. We all thought back in, oh God knows, the 90s, we saw the internet coming. We thought, oh, that's going to be a thing, isn't it? Journalists thought it was the best thing they'd ever heard of, because it meant that we could just chuck our stories up on the page very, very quickly. We thought that people would consume more news. And actually, one of the things Facebook has done has actually increased the consumption of news. We could argue whether it's good news, but the actual volume has gone up enormously. However, the number of people who can create news now has gone up. You know, that's everyone here. It's more or less everyone who has a phone, which means supply and demand has been brutal to journalists and to publishers. So even though the amount of advertising has gone up, it's shared amongst many, many more people. And that's why the Murdoch media, the BBC, the Guardian are all so very worked up about, Google pays academics. That was actually in the Wall Street Journal, another Murdoch newspaper, a whole week ago. Yet it's now news in the UK. This is not news. This is the vendetta. And where we are heading, because these people are still listened to by legacy politicians or backwards compatible politicians, because these people are listened to, we are heading towards a world. One of the things the BBC is promoting, which is the scariest thing I've heard pretty much this century, is that they're promoting the idea of registered journalists. Does anyone else remember equity cards, where you could only get to work as a actor or actress, as we used to call them in the older, less politically correct days, if you were related to or had slept with an existing member of equity? That was the old corrupt days. But do you really want licensed journalists? Because if you're going to have attribution, that's what you're going to have. You're going to have. So,
Dominic, it seems to me that what we're trying to do here is recreate in this, internet economy some form of authority. Authority figures in a way. Let's accredit journalists, register journalists, which has got some creepy connotations.
No, it's not creepy connotations. That is bad. There's not creepy or
so what
ambiguous.
We're talking about is in a world where where speech is democratized, where anybody can get access to to a social network and to a bigger audience, the value of any particular voice is lower, and the value of authority and of existing institutions is also lower. I'm wondering, how do we? Is this just a phase we're going through? And I'm going to go to Gabrielle on this actually, because you work a lot in countries where the problem is not that we've got too many voices, but where we've got a lot of state-owned media, and where that's the problem. So it seems to me that some of the things that we worry about in the healthy democracies are things that can be actually used in this sense of what did you call it? False information and criminalizing journalism in other countries. So, is the cure worse than the disease?
Well, obviously, like the problems in some parts of the world in relation to fake news are really quite not the same. I think like when we're talking about, for example, what's happening with new technology and how the problem should be tackled, it's definitely not quite the same. Like, say, if you're someone in Egypt or if you're someone in another part of the world where now anyone, if they might be sharing false information, they might be criminalized. That's quite extreme example. And obviously, from an international perspective, which is what we do, we would say that this is wholly disproportionate. Similarly, and that's the point that Joanna was making, is like when you're imposing some sort of liability because you've disseminated false information, given that it's impossible to define effectively, and statements of facts, opinion, and so on, that's also disproportionate. So I think then the next question is more like what we're seeing here, how you have this competition between, you have different stories, and how, you have like this giant marketplace of ideas and it's all online, and how you're able to form your opinion and get a sense of, the reliability of your source and your information. So, and, who's actually putting forward like good articles, and, it's the quality of what you're putting out that means that hopefully you get more readers, and you're able to do better on the internet. So
yeah, that's certainly the ideal, isn't it? Oh, sure. Let me get the glasses on. We've got a question from Joanna. Oh, can you read it, Olivier?
Well, she can speak it. She can
Oh, great.
I could try saying it, if you can guys hear me. Can you hear me? Is it working? Yes, you're smiling. I think it's working. Okay, so I really appreciated the discussion on journalism. I think it's one of the crucial points. As I was trying to say, regardless the echo, I think it's the question of journalistic diligence or professionalism that we're discussing here. So fake news should not come from journalists, from professional journalists like Dominic himself, for example. But Dominic was going on about how broad this notion is. So I wanted to come back with a question at Dominic, but I would be happy to hear the opinions of other panelists as well. Who is a journalist in 2017? How do you know what level of professionalism, or my favorite term, diligence, they should represent? So when we're speaking about the new media, the old media as you have shown us on paper, and the new media that we all know, that is Instagram, that is Facebook, I think, that is Twitter. All of a sudden I'm a journalist with my 140 followers. So who is a journalist, and how do we know that they're professionals and they could be trusted? Thank you.
You do it like you do anyone else you take from advice. One of the reasons I'm quite scornful of Mark Ruffalo is that he also believes that the Zika virus in Africa was caused by a British company attempting to do something dodgy with malaria. In other words, you look at what these people have said. And one of the reasons I'm quite skeptical about the impact of fake news is that all you have to do is say, well, this site really does have, as many of these sites do, they really do seem to hate Hillary Clinton. And unfortunately, some of the traditional media does seem to be going down the heavily partisan route because that's what people like. But I just would chuck in the thing there that when people share stories, they share them, as you say, with people like themselves. And if you just look at the general trend with social media, the younger you are, the more you use social media as a good rough rule. So why, if fake news was so supportive of Donald Trump and Brexit, do we observe that Donald Trump succeeded? Because those people, the people who got the most news from Facebook, should have been the people he shouldn't have won. But yet, it's an exact opposite to what we got. So journalists like anyone, like the bloke in the pub, a bloke in a pub who tells you, they're going to build some sort of road near your house. If he says that and there isn't a road built near your house, you're going to start downweighting what he says. When you go and look at my articles, if you think they're garbage, don't read my stuff. And that's all you have to do.
All right. Thanks, Karima, once again there.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point that you make about the reader in the end deciding who a journalist is an important one. I think that there is a and I would link it to the point you made about consumption of news, and the amount of news that people are receiving has gone up a huge amount. There's a very open question, which is a lot of people who perhaps haven't been used to consuming news through social media or online are now consuming news through social media and online. And I think that on most measures, we would say that's a really good thing. But the question then arises, which is, are we providing adequate transparency and tools and information to those people to be able to judge adequately whether, make the judgment calls that you talked about? And I think that's a very interesting question. That's one of the things that we look at, is that, are we making sure that it's clear what the news source is? Are we making sure people don't, for example, put a fake domain name on? One of the easiest ways in which you can spread news on a platform would be to make it look like it comes from a news source that people have heard of. And so that's those kinds of things are really, really important. I think to go to the question of the original question about journalism, and I just point out I do need to. My fiance's birthday today, so I do need to go. But the question of what is a journalist, I'd go to the other question, which is, what do we need in order to have a thriving public debate in terms of journalism, and how do we make sure that we have it? and that we ensure that we've got systems, you know, sort of systems across our society that ensure that those journalists thrive. And I go back to the questions I posed ourselves at the beginning, which is about, you know, is there a business model for good quality, well-researched journalism to thrive? And that is that's a very, very big question. And it's one that we, you know, some people have responded to it in different ways to others, but we launched a whole range of projects with journalists to try and get to the bottom of how we can make sure that there is that, because I think we think it's very, very important. Now, some people would say that that's picking winners and that's ensuring that the established players remain the established players. And it's, you know, what's the right answer? What's the wrong answer? None of these questions are easy, but they're the kind of things that we're grappling with.
Thank you very much, Karim. So have you got another few minutes to spare with us if we have a question from the audience for you?
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to go straight. With apologies to Philip, who I haven't called on yet. Have we got a question from the audience for Karim before he leaves? Is there anyone who has a burning question to put to Facebook? Are you all such kind, lovely people? You want him to go to his dinner? No, excellent. Hands up.
You mentioned that Facebook can't be the arbiter of right and wrong and the truth and so on. So what type of process can you put in place which engages societal players who can help make those types of decisions? And we have elected representatives, we have representatives of various different groups who can help you address the question, which would then take the onus off you.
Is this working? There are some people who would say nobody can and nobody should, and society shouldn't have an arbiter of truth, and that's a perfectly legitimate answer to that question. I think that how I would personally approach this is to say that, if leaving aside the question of can somebody arbitrate truth or not, societies generally come to a view about what facts are and what the shared facts are, from which they then debate what to do next as a government or as a society, and how to respond to a certain challenge and so on. And that it's really, really important to make sure that you have systems and places whereby that can happen in a way that doesn't, the way that Mark Zuckerberg talked about it was bring people together rather than push them apart. And that's a really hard thing to define, a really hard thing to explain. And I don't think necessarily that there's ever going to be one institution and one place that happens. But I think it's about looking at, I go back to that point I made about sensationalist articles being shared without being read. It's about can we build up institutions that can play a part in. So one of the things we talk about in hate speech, for example, where we wouldn't want to be in a position whereby we ban certain types of speech from the internet because that's a very draconian, difficult thing to do. We want to make sure that we remove content that's that's beyond a certain set of boundaries that we can all discuss. But within that, there's still going to be lots of speech we find unpleasant and upsetting. So how do we build institutions and organizations that can respond and that can do counter narratives? And so one of the things we did during the general election was we worked with an organization called Full Fact, who do fact checking of mainstream media, of mainstream politicians, but also of some of the more fringe elements. And we funded their work, and we helped them disseminate that on our platform, not with any particular target of any particular news stories, or not with any particular news organizations or politicians in mind, but just with a view to saying, actually, let's get more facts, more information out there, and sort of see if that helps. And I think that those kinds of things are the kinds of things you can do. But I just don't think there's ever going to be anybody who's there going, yep, that's true, that's not. When we have libel laws and things like that, and they're very controversial.
But isn't there also scope for Facebook to open up its platform a little more to third-party APIs, for example, providing fact-checking from different sources? You know, I know the Knight Foundation in the US has put a lot of research, and there are new organizations emerging that can actually do so. So when you get an article, it may have a couple of flags on it that says, hey, a few fact-checking organizations think this one might be problematic. Can you guys do a bit more than you're doing now, or do you plan to do more to open up your platform, which is basically the turbocharged public sphere right now, to third party, or to just for emergent solutions that people are working on?
So one of the things we tested in the US in the last few months, and we tested it in a few other countries as well, is that once a certain number of people flag something as fake news, that it would then get sent in a queue to a number of fact-checking organizations who could then fact-check that, and it would then be flagged, this has been disputed by X number of fact-checkers and so on. And that was a really important thing to try and do. It's one of a range of different things that we're looking at trying to do. And none of these are going to be a silver bullet, and many of them won't work. You know, lots of them just won't influence people, or will be annoying, or we'll find that in the end, you know, they're too intrusive. It's not really our role to do that, and so on and so forth. And there's a whole mix of things in that space. One of the things that we did in the UK during the general election was, rather than tell anyone anything been fact checked or anything, was when somebody read a political story in the last sort of week of the campaign on the platform, we flagged to them, we asked, you know, any of the political parties that had a Facebook page to fill in sections on different issues, so immigration, the economy, blah, 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 and the whole list, and said, fill in, you know, if you fill in that in, you know, we'll put it in this system. And basically, whenever anyone read a story about the election, it popped up and said, well, here's what in randomly generated order, here's what all the political parties think about this issue. And that was a way of putting in front of people a broader range of information and some factual information and so on. None of these things are silver bullets. They're not going to solve these problems, but they are an attempt to try and sort of try new things out and experiment with it. So it's not going to be it's going to be a long process of getting right the balance between what our role is, what society's role is. One of the things we did with Full Fact was we simply put an advert in people's newsfeed saying, look, here's the 10 things you should look out for when looking at a source, you know, trying to source news. You know, what does good journalism look like, you know, and work with First Draft network of journalists to come up with a 10-point plan. Is it the right 10-point plan? I'm not the expert, you know, but it's an attempt.
Well, it's a very good start. Thank you. Karim and Pawan, thank you very much for participating in the panel. We're going to let you go, but I know everybody probably wants to thank you with a little bit. Okay, so we are going to open this up completely for questions now. We've covered a fair bit of ground, but not as much as I'd like to. And I also want to hear more from Philip on all sorts of things. So, yes, we had one question there. Andrew, have you got the microphone?
I have.
Fire away.
Already waiting. I was going to ask a question to the Facebook guy, but that opportunity's passed. But is, in your view, fake news only an issue for, let's say, dealing with political insecurity, or is there any real value to worrying about it? The question I was going to have for the Facebook guy was whether there are any actual tools that you can give to help the media literacy that he was arguing, which I agree with is the best approach for handling fake news. But yes, do you think it is purely something that arises from political insecurity, or is there some value add to trying to do something about fake news officially?
So yeah, and we're almost back to the definitional question of, is this a real problem, or is it just a kind of a contemporary moral panic? Philip?
Well, I will use the example which led to a very sharp rise in measles in this country and killed, about 5,000 or 6,000 children, all based on an academic creating a set of scare stories to get research funding for a program that was going to be shut down. That is an example of the way in which fake news kills a few thousand kids who would not otherwise have died of complications of measles. You know, fake news has all sorts of issues going well beyond politics. It can be quite lethal and dangerous. But then you have the question of which is actually fake news and which is a whistleblower identifying a problem which hasn't otherwise been picked up. And there you've got, for example, the people in North Staffs who were being muzzled as they tried to get stuff into the local newspapers and elsewhere. And it took a long time for the scandals to come to light. So, fake news, which is it? But it there are real issues here going well beyond, the allegations of politicians one way or t'other.
Mark Elizer from London School of Economics. I've actually been researching deception and the way it travels across the internet and social media for the past 5 years now. So the kind of fake news thing has been, I don't even know where to begin. Some of the comments and the suggestions of the panel I've found quite egregious. Some of them I found quite agreeable. It's a shame that the Facebook guy has left, because I would have put him on the spot, because everybody has to remember that Facebook does have a vested interest in not being characterized as an editor. The second that they get characterized as an editor or as a publisher, then liability starts under the e-commerce directive. And I think that's something that we don't want to be the arbiters of truth. We don't want to be the arbiters of truth in that. Well, Google does that with the right to be forgotten. I mean, this is what we're doing with private companies now, is we're putting them in this place where they have to make decisions that involve human rights. And whether we like it or not, that is the role that Facebook is going to have to play. I don't think this is necessarily a journalistic question as much as the panel has made it out. I mean, this has all been traced back to Macedonian teenagers who are doing this for commercial benefit. And on some levels, it's just simply fraud. We have a pyramid of compliance and deterrence models where we can apply penalties to people based upon the serious nature of the fake news that has been spread across the platform. To answer your question, there is ample evidence that the American election was affected by very small amounts of people in very close constituencies and very close electoral districts that were affected by fake news. And you see 0.5% or 1% of the population changing their votes, and you ask them post-exit polls, why did you do it? And they said, because I read this story about Hillary Clinton and her emails, or I read this story about Hillary Clinton, or I was a Catholic and I was from Pennsylvania and I saw that the Pope had endorsed Donald Trump. And these were the reasons, these were the tipping points where people had made these decisions about why they chose a particular candidate or another. The comment from the journalist here about the sort of social media, things don't begin and end on social media. People go read something on social media, then they go to the pub and they tell their pals. Social media does not exist in a vacuum. It does have an effect on the way society views news stories. And I think at the end of the day, what we're characterizing as fake news isn't news at all. It's a commercial enterprise that people people in Macedonia were making tens of thousands of dollars a month in clickbait on pro-Donald Trump stories. And when probably not telling people things that they don't already know, and when they went off and when they asked people about what was going, why they did this, we just made stuff up, and people tended to click it. So the more outrageous the headline it was, the more money we made. And that was the underlying principles of fake news. It was simply a commercial enterprise. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Mark. Would you mind passing the mic straight back to Malcolm Huddy behind you?
Could I just answer that? Because you're at the London School of Economics, which does still cling to the idea that it does social sciences. I've also done social sciences. And pretty much in the first week or so, one of the things you do is that people lie. If you ask people why they do things, why they did the thing that you actually observed them do, they will make up the most outrageous nonsense. And you possibly can even tell me the name of the law, the name of the seminal paper, where someone showed most people will cite factors for why they made a decision when that factor was only made aware with them after they had made the decision. Asking people as they come out of polling stations, what, if anything, they made their choice on, is barely counts as data at all. You asked the Clinton campaign, and I have read the series of interviews with the Clinton campaign. The email thing grossly undermined it. The fact that their strategy was basically anti-white men, surprisingly enough, alienated white men. Guess who voted for Trump? And I come back to my original factor, a simple and clear correlation that the more Facebook people watch, the more they voted Clinton. So the idea that Facebook was helping Clinton really has a severe, just basic causality problem. And I watched...
All right, let's go on to Malcolm.
Thank you. We've spoken quite a lot about the fakeness of fake news, and we've spoken a bit about journalism. I wanted to have a word about the audience. The audience for fake news, I mean, not this audience.
Discriminating.
Okay, you know what? Fine, let's make it about us. Yeah. Kareem was talking about the view that he thinks that Facebook has to try and bring us together and bring us to one sort of consensus view. Not an achievable goal, but something nice and aspirational and cozy to work towards. And back in the day when there was a single-digit number of broadcast terrestrial television channels and broadsheet newspapers had a large circulation and stuff like that, there were very few, relatively speaking, voices, shall we say. There were very few points of view. There was very little news that was written about. Incidentally, a lot of this news that we're talking about, most of it isn't news in the literal sense of the term. Most of it is opinion. And I don't mean propaganda from that point of view. I mean the raw, hard, factual content, as opposed to the selection, the framing, the curation, the value judgments as to what is significant or what is tied to something else and what isn't, all of which is a form of opinion. But the actual raw, factual information is relatively small. And this has an impact when you move beyond the world where there's a single-digit number of television channels. Because when it comes to the opinion aspects of it, the framing and the selection and so forth, other people have their own opinions. And while in the old world of old media, we had this rather cozy notion that we and people like us, who have an education and who use words for a living and all that sort of stuff, we all form a sort of group bubble of collected consensus idea of what the facts are, and we kid ourselves because the rest of the world doesn't partake in that expressive media, that they believe us. And we think that something has changed when we moved to the world where suddenly everyone can speak and be heard. But I'm not sure that anything has changed. I just think we're noticing that other people don't believe what the media bubble and the political classes or whatever. I'll make this a straightforwardly Marxist analysis here, or neo-Marxist analysis here. It's a class issue. There are people here, there are people that have a view of what is right and wrong, and what is the way that you should look at the world, and what is expressive. And there are other people who vote Trump. Mm-hmm. And they don't agree with
Malcolm,
anything
I'm absolutely devastated to hear the news that the good old days weren't quite as good as we have been led to believe.
Well, I mean, I'd be much more interested in the comments. So may I just make the reaction to the last gentleman? I'd be much more interested in these sorts of comments about how the harm that has been done by shifting elections to people voting the wrong way. If you give examples about the so-called harm that you think fake news has done in a direction that you liked rather than one that you disliked.
Very good. Okay, so we had Gabrielle first and then Philip.
Yes, I was also, I mean, I'm not sure if I understood completely the argument that the gentleman was making here, but like, I think again, I come at it maybe from a like too legal perspective, but at the same time, when you're talking, for example, of fraud and all of these things, these are like, you know, it's pretty heavy stuff. It's, you know, it has legal connotations, meaning that you're doing something knowingly with a particular intent. So, you know, and here, like, usually when you're talking about, say, restrictions on free expression and what might be justifiable, like one of them is incitement to violence. But here again, like you have like intent and, you know, and the end game is violence. It's not as is, and then there's the likelihood of it happening. And what you're talking about is as Malcolm was saying, is, you know, people changing their opinion. So I just don't really know what's, like, if you're implying there should be some sort of liability for doing these things, like, because everybody's like, governments, the reason I've been talking about all these criminal laws, for instance, like these governments want to control public opinion, and so they're criminalizing people for it. But what do you think should be done about companies like Facebook? Do you think that the like liability is something that should be done? Because I don't know. I'm just trying to understand the.
Yeah, I think one of the I'm not ashamed to admit, I got fooled by a website which had the domain name MSNBC Breaking News Headlines.com, and the website had a non-sensational headline and it had a reasonable story until you got to the bottom of it. But what got me was that the entire web page mirrored MSNBC's. And to me, that is fraud, right? It is a commercial. It is a trying to get a benefit. It was ads like you would expect on MSNBC. The domain name, which Facebook, the gentleman from Facebook did bring up, is a problem. That can be resolved through the UDRP process. And I was surprised that MSNBC had not taken.
I think it would have been a spoof domain name. It would have actually been part of it.
But I genuinely thought this was a real website until I got to the very bottom, and then I was like, I've been duped, right?
And you know, Stanford ran a study only in the last 6 months, didn't they, where they found out that most of Stanford students could not, and high school students, and could not distinguish between fake news and real news, and actually couldn't distinguish between content and advertising. So we are into a fairly murky world here.
And sorry, I'll just close here, but that can also get tricky because, like, in some countries, actually, there's also like all these different provisions around criminalizing spoofing and all that kind of thing. And obviously that becomes a problem when, you know, the spoof website is actually for comical effect, etc. Where you're talking about something different. But again, I think it also highlights like all the different forms of deception.
Yes. There's a spectrum there.
There's a spectrum, and you have like, and sometimes you may well find actually there are different provisions that cater for like different aspects.
Which is why I gave the example of an inverted pyramid, in that some areas.
All right. And we will. But first, we will hear from Philip. Then we will hear from you, lovely man who was doing the swaying and dancing a short while ago. Then we have a man in the middle, and then we have Mini Dominic.
Right. I want to pull together your arguments and also Malcolm's arguments. Because they actually come together, because it's all driven by pay-per-click advertising. Now, according to an article in The Drum recently, this is now a 15 billion a year fraudulent enterprise. The revenues are quite phenomenal on pay-per-click, and it's one of the reasons why the journals get to see virtually no genuine income, and why it is most people who pay for pay-per-click adverts. The market is hopefully about to implode, because Procter & Gamble have gone on strike or won't touch a number of media, various other big advertisers. They're just totally pissed off with algorithmically placed adverts, which put their brand alongside a jihadi video or what have you, alongside anything that's there to attract clicks, which they then pay for in their advertising bill. But also, this also links into the fact that the internet has more or less wiped out classified advertising. And by wiping out classified advertising, it's wiped out local journalism. And the local papers which conveyed the views of real prejudiced local people and then fed stories which might get collected up in the centre. That entire tier of trainee journalism, validated journalism, people who might go round and break the windows of the newspaper if it got the story too wrong, that whole tier of democratically accountable journalism has been wiped out, leaving us with just the London Village and the global media and everything that's generated from the kids in Macedonia hunting their clicks.
Thank you, Phil. And indeed another voice for democratic accountability generally. Now, gentleman at the back.
I'm sorry, Mini Dom. Dave Marcel. I'm just a treasurer. I just do a little bit of funding through BCS for something called DevSecOps. I don't know if you're aware of it, but most of the development of all the platforms you've got on the planet are probably one guy on a laptop somewhere using GitHub. I'm not joking. What I think is more important about the attribution and the value is a sort of memory thing here. I was an archivist at Bletchley Park, and we're now at the age where everyone is an intelligence analyst. And when you had a Bletchley Park INTSUM come out, it was always cited as a reliable source. And sometimes you'd had someone with really good intelligence in the field, and they'd say, no, my source is reliable. Why do you always put a usually reliable source? So we actually have a formal definition, a cryptographically signed attribution. Great stuff, Enigma keys. And it's a bit debatable as to whether Morris Sr., who put Enigma into Unix, which is all those lovely systems that make DevOps in your systems, is the first person to do the most damage, or his son, who invented the Morris worm. And we've seen DNS break recently, where one of the coders at ISC basically used vulnerabilities to create a new top-level root. We are now in a chilled time where it is illegal for anyone inside US government to do any research in this area. We are also in a chilled time where for $200,000 retail, $50,000 if you know what you're doing, you can destroy the online reputation of any journalist forever. There are systems like Liarbook where I can take Philip's fine voice, produce in a couple of hours something that's awful, put it out unattributed, and destroy Philip forever. Although I suspect those that know him might resurrect him. We are now in the time where you can digitally hold your certificates, your record of what you do online and all that crap you download, so you know what you had. We also now have the ability to say where it's from. There are studies in the DNSSEC domains of some of this phone news, and I've got the papers here if anyone wants to share them, feel free. But the last thing I'll say is, because of work done by the Electronic Freedom Federation, there's a system called CertBot. Anyone can become a CA and they can run it on an IoT device. That's it really. We've got the technical solutions. Maybe it's time people start to sign their work. And as technologists, we started to give them the support they need. Because up until now, hackers left journalists alone. Now you are it.
And that, my friends, is a chilling effect. Thank you. Gentleman in the blue shirt.
Thomas Farrick, the glamorous title being the Chief Technical Officer of the Vote Leave campaign. So I tweeted that bus quite a lot. That bus is has a certain number on the side of it. That number is from table 9.9 of the ONS Pink Table Book. That is the official government records of what we spend every year. Now, I'm sure we all agree that the government might lie to us. But it is a source. It is a reasonable source. We can all argue if the ONS table is a sensible source. I think campaigns have a moral and very important duty to publish their sources. The first speaker here today something commented on that bus. There has been no campaign since or before that publish so many sources as the Vote Leave campaign. Now, I think there needs to be some sensible discussion, an important discussion on the role and responsibility of fake news. There's certainly many articles that have been published that are quite aggressive on both sides of the argument. What I want to know is, what can a campaign do to convince someone that they are trying? What is the level that you would be happy with? Because we thought we tried quite hard. What more would you want?
You could try publishing your funding. That would also help.
Oh, could I confirm you have gone to the Electoral Commission website? If you type in Vote Leave expenditure and Vote Leave donations, you will find every donation received more than £500.
Oh, interesting. As a citizen of the Republic of Ireland, I've taken a great interest in the various activities of the DUP, but I suspect that's out of scope for this discussion, sadly. Minnie Dominic, have you a question for us?
So, as you may be able to tell, I'm a teenager, and therefore I use social media more than most people with other demographics. And therefore most of my friends are also teenagers. This is true for most people. And I know not one person in my entire school who is for Donald Trump unironically. Many people make jokes, you know, oh, I love Donald Trump, like the whole thing about UKIP, where people make jokes about that. I think a problem is not necessarily people who use social media a lot, because people who use social media a lot see a lot from both sides of clickbait, obviously fake things. And through my 16 years experience on this planet, I've slowly managed to tune out the obviously fake clickbait, the pop-up, you will win a free iPhone things. I think the big problem is just people who come across this, people who aren't particularly well versed, who haven't used social media or the internet for a while, and then suddenly one day pops up on their phone saying, no, Donald Trump has said this great thing, we must all like Donald Trump, or Hillary Clinton has said this great thing. And I think that leads to a problem, because young people aren't the voters. Young people don't vote. This is an observed statistic. I think, yes, as my dad said, we need to get people to be more aware of fake news, because most people who use social media are aware of it. It's just the couple of outliers who use it rarely, see this one thing, and then share it with their friends in real life, who give this thing, saying, look, I found this great thing, look at it, or change your mind on this. And that, I think, is at least one of the main factors to this rapid explosion. Also, just another thing to the guy mentioning Certbot, I host my own Git repo. It uses Certbot. I didn't want to go up to my dad and say, please, can you fill in private details and get this certificate, which then expires in a year. I wanted to get, and when Certbot came along, because I run Firefox, it pinged up at the bottom, I went, oh, I'll get that. And I think this goes to anonymity as well, because with certificates, I can create a person, and this person can perfectly represent me in every way. But the key thing is it's not linked to who I am, because the online threats, the actually scary ones, are not people saying, I'm going to take down your website, I'm a hacker. It's people saying, I'm going to come to your house, I know where you live. I've got my friends, we're going to do nasty things to you. And if you separate anonymity, if you separate who the person physically is from who they mentally are, you can help start moving away from biases, which come from sexism, racism, people saying this person says this thing about politics, therefore I disagree with them about everything. You can start making a personality which talks about things, because it's not who says what it is, it's being consistently right. If you have as my dad was saying, you have journalists who have spent their entire lives writing, articles which are pretty much always true. And then you have one person writing a sensationalist thing. If you have anonymity, you can have a person writing things which isn't connected to a real person, but they've continued writing this thing under this little certificate they put after everything. You can't fake it with a little audio converter. You can't Photoshop their face onto something. You have to put something which governments rely on to be secure. I think that is one of the ways forward for helping keeping things accurate. Because if you have journalists, they're going to be scared that someone's going to write something. I mean, you said £50,000 take out someone's entire livelihood. If I'm a throwaway account writing a clickbait article, I don't care. I mean, yeah, sure, after 2 weeks they'll find it, but that was already done. I've earned several £1 million. I'm fine. I think that's what we need to do. Move away from sort of linking the internet life, real life, because that leads to a whole bunch of problems. We just leave anonymity, or at least a disconnect between real life and the internet.
Thank you very much. And listen, I'm so sorry for yes, and applause. What is your actual name? If you, unless you wish to remain anonymous, of course.
I'll bring up my RSA key, but it's way too long to read out.
So,
I'll make a mistake.
With apologies for the disrespect of how I've been referring to you.
No, I'm Harlan. I had the same name as my dad, same last name anyway.
Thank you very much, Harlan. Harlan, your mastery of the issues and of the technology has made me feel more cheerful than I think I pretty much have all year. So thank you very much. Does anyone else have anything they wish to add on the panel to finish off, and to bearing in mind you have to top what Harlan said?
Well, actually, yes. I mean, Harlan has been the sort of what we refer to as 2.0 back at home. Harlan has had more political education and more technology education than I guess he feels entirely happy with one way or another. But he says we have, like most people, but we do it on purpose. We have no internet filtering at home. His school has the most exquisite, incompetently implemented, but exquisite filtering stuff to make sure that they don't see controversial stuff at school. If you want, regardless of your political or faith opinion, you would be outraged if you saw the RS syllabus in British schools. I would characterize it as, imagine doing the 20th century and doing it in a way that no one was bad in the 20th century. Literally no one was bad to anyone else at all, except for a few people who weren't real Germans. They are like that. And Israel, in terms of fake news, Israel wasn't destroyed in 1973, which is one of the textbooks that my son was given. But we are not preparing children adequately for this world. They need to be exposed to fake news. But we have no platforming. We have no platforming at schools. We have no platforming in this conversation. And we have no platforming at universities, where people who are beyond the pale, oh, we mustn't let children hear from, I don't know, all these bad people, Nigel Farage, all these other bad people, we mustn't because they're sexist or racist. How are children supposed to work out what the bad stuff is? Yes, we can show the 1930s videos from, is it true that he's pronounced, how do you pronounce Goebbels? Okay, Goebbels. I thought you pronounced it something else. Goebbels. Yeah, but showing people 1930s horror propaganda is like showing people 1930s adverts for shoes. They just don't really click with anyone except if they really, really want to. We need to prepare our children for this. We need to show them controversial stuff. Because Harlan's, we have no filtering. We have how many books on fascism in the library at home? We have quite a lot of books. We have a complete library of fascism and a variety of things on how to build a variety of very dangerous things. Because we're geeks. And actually that's stuff from my wife's degree. She did fascism. It's a standard part of political philosophy. You have to study this. Would you let your children study fascism? At Oxford now, if you are doing the theology course and you find that the course unit is about a faith you don't like, you don't have to do it. Right? This is people studying theology at what some people think is a relatively good university. We are not preparing our children for controversy. We weren't preparing them before. And they are seeing this stuff. There are these nanny filters for YouTube. If my children couldn't outwit such a filter than I'd installed, I would have failed as a parent. And most people never install in the first place. So they are seeing this stuff. They are growing up in a world where the absolute fakes for MSNBC, which are illegal under existing laws, there's copyright law, if nothing else, and trademark law, these things are illegal now. I know one of our local Lib Dems sent out what was, to all intensive purposes, an exact duplicate of the Conservative Party local leaflet, except it said bad things about the Tories. I mean, you know, that's just life. I'm sure you'll find something from all the parties that do things. But if you're not preparing children, if you keep them in their little snowflake world where their view on the world is not ever changed. I was taught history by 2 card-carrying members of the Communist Party. We need to move on from just sheltering our children to educating our children.
Gabrielle.
So it's quite a tough job coming after this. Well, I mean, in many ways, I agree with what actually Dominic said, because, I mean, you know, working for a free speech organization, obviously, like for us, seeing like material being taken down and people arguing and say, oh, you know, you shouldn't see this. Like what we advocate for is more debate. Actually, like encouraging people to kind of find out, okay, like what is the source of this information, and all this comes through education. So it's pretty much the same thing. And some of the initiatives that were talked about by Facebook, to the extent that they kind of help identify and flag when something might be okay, like might want to check that this information is accurate. All these things are good things. I don't think we wouldn't agree, like, you know, whether when it comes to censoring the information, we don't think it's the way forward. What you need is, you know, being exposed to lots of different materials to actually learn how to recognize, for, you know, what's good or bad, and form your own opinions.
I think first point to make is that probably about 2/3 of what is in the history books at school is fake news. The only bits that's real are the dates that monarchs were born and died, and who actually won which battles. How the battles were won is usually fake, and, you know, virtually everything else about economic growth and why things happen and so on is again fake. It's just digested. So one of the issues is, so what's new? What's new is the sheer volume of fake and the way in which it's broadcast, and the way in which we don't train our children, and I will use the word train rather than educate, to try and find the provenance of what they are told. And one of the issues here is, so what more should we be doing to enable people to check the provenance of the communications that they receive over the internet, or the news stories that they receive over the internet, bearing in mind we also have this great tradition of using it for free speech and protection of the oppressed. And one of my hobby horses is the need to distinguish between those areas where we want provenance and those areas where we want anonymity. And where you do want anonymity, the anonymity should be robustly protected and genuinely provided, because most of the sites that I've seen that claim and services to offer anonymity have already been broken by the surveillance services of most of the world's oppressive regimes. So once again, you have fake news as to the validity of these wonderful privacy protection technologies. You know, almost, we have a great problem here, and John Donne is one of my favorite poets. John Donne, metaphysical poetry, complex love poetry, but he was also Dean of St. Paul's at a time of great turmoil. And one of his sermons, poems, "High on a hill, truth stands, and he who would reach her about must and about must go, and what the hill's suddenness resists wins so." It's extremely difficult to find out what is the truth. And in Islam, there are 99 paths to God. Your task is to find out which is the right one for you. And if anybody tells you that they know the right path from you, shun them, because they are an apostate. Only you know the right way. So it's a multi-faith type thing. But how to actually find the truth, extremely difficult. But I think ISOC has a duty to try and help the internet community make it less impossible.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Philip. I'd like to thank all of our panelists today, Karim Palant, Dominic Connor, Gabrielle Gilman and Philip Virgo, and also Caroline Greer and Olivier Crépin-Leblanc, who have put together a fantastic event for all of us, and the Worshipful Company of Information Technologists, who have very, very kindly hosted us in this fabulous venue tonight. Thank you all for coming.
And I was just going to add one last thing, which is we do have these events every now and then. If you have any topic of interest that you would like to see discussed, then please send them over to us, contact@isoc-e.org, and we'll be very happy to consider them and to put together something like this, a gathering for us to go and discuss. But now I think we have some refreshments and some food next door. So thanks everyone for coming here. It's been a real pleasure. And thanks for those people who followed us remotely. Thanks and goodbye.